HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Killing Strangers: How Political Violence Became Modern by T.K. Wilson. Read by Matthew Lloyd Davies. Preface. Some go in for counting beads, more go in for chasing women. The scholar sits at home and reads. Give me the glass with porter brimming. I never was much good at maths or indeed seduction. Reading, it is true, has been more of a personal strength, or obsession. But either way, it is certainly now high time for a drink, and a chance to reflect. Writing a book is an inevitably educational experience. One learns through a few notorious lapses that self-indulgence does not notably improve self-awareness. I'm not stressed, I'm focused. As a pet project, the book so monstrously petted inevitably becomes a monstrous pet. Weekends and evenings disappear mechanically down its ravenous maw. Even a short book represents a long haul. So my thanks, first and foremost, to family for waiting with such patience until Killing Strangers was finally skewered and dispatched. To my children, to Anna, Johnny, and Rosie, I am sorry for all of my frequent absences, both mental and physical. To Anna, thank you for your help in compiling an ever-shifting bibliography. Here you made the great mistake of proving yourself genuinely useful for the future. Johnny and Rosie, I'm sorry that I followed any of your suggestions as to what this book should really be about. But to all three of my children, what matters is this. You are my emotional foundation in this world, and a healthy reminder of how little this book really matters. To my beloved Denise, all my own words of thanks are tawdry and trite, so I'll plunder some from Friedrich Schiller instead. Wir einholdes Weib errungen, mich seinen Jubel ein, which means roughly, whoever has won a lovely wife, he too should join in the general jubilation. And I do, every single day. You have taught me how to live. My own parents, Tony and Tina Wilson, launched me on this path many years ago in what I now realize was a highly supportive academic environment, and succeeding in making intellectual curiosity seem formal and foundational. To them, this book is dedicated as a token of appreciation. I hope they will forgive my advertising their ages in it. Like the Victorian imperialist of whom it was said that his knowledge of foreign relations must have been acquired in a music hall, but without his values, I have been somewhat surprised by my own official apotheosis as an expert in international relations. I suspect many of my academic colleagues have been too. And yet these colleagues have welcomed this stray refugee from a history department with nothing but warmth and encouragement since 2011. I deeply appreciate that. A special thanks are due to Ryan Beasley, Roddy Brett, Karen Gentry, Tony Lang, and Gabriella Slomp for all their personal and professional encouragement down the years. We at St Andrews still miss the untimely loss of Alex Danchev, Nick Renger, and Mark Curry, as so many further afield doubtless do as well. More specifically, this book firmly belongs to the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, CSTPV, the oldest such research centre in Europe, founded in 1994, and, I dare to think, still the finest. Somehow I have found myself its director in 2016. The support of colleagues in this new role has been deeply humbling. My gratitude thus goes to Diego Muro, Peter Lehr, Bernhard Blumenau, Gilbert Ramsey, Nick Brooke, Kieran McConaughey, and Javier Argomaniz. Everything would have ground to a shuddering halt long ago without the administrative support of Julie Middleton and Kim Cartwright, needless to say. And Gillian Brunton alone knows all she does for the centre, the lead engineer in the CSTPV engine room. We would not get far without her. None of this would have been possible without the sterling backup and mentoring given to me down long years by Richard English. His support and mentoring have never flagged, ever since he bought me lunch as a postgraduate student at Queen's University Belfast back in 2001, and then gave me a job at St Andrews 10 years later. He has taught me more than he knows, and I trust he will recognise his influence in some of what follows. Others who seem to have believed in me and from whom I have learned infinite amounts are Alvin Jackson, Koivanich David, Ian McBride, Senya Paseta, and Roy Foster. In scale, my intellectual debts to Mark Mulholland err towards truly aristocratic excess. I humbly and gratefully acknowledge them here. Across the Atlantic, Bruce Hoffman at Georgetown has been a huge support and encouragement down long years. I deeply value that friendship. At a crucial juncture, Audrey Cronin thoughtfully hand-delivered a copy of her Power to the People to St. Andrews, allowing me early sight of a superb study that overlaps with, but I hope does not entirely preempt, my own. When I first met Martha Crenshaw, circa 2012, she generously expressed an interest in my research on the deep background of political violence. She has had a very long wait to see what I might produce, but I hope this book may still be of some interest to her. Likewise, Max Abrams has consistently been a heavyweight cheerleader and supporter for CSTPV. For all such kindnesses, both formal and informal, I offer sincere thanks. A scholar is truly lucky to have such friends. All have planted many good ideas in my mind. All my errors I harvested without assistance. Students have also taught me far more than they can possibly realize. I am particularly grateful to Dan Keenan for all support. Librarians and archivists, the engineering corps of the Army of Knowledge, were invariably helpful at every turn. We could not advance far without the foundations they lay down. For grace under pressure, therefore, I especially wish to thank the staffs of St. Andrew's Library, the British Library, the Bodleian Library, and the National Archives in London. Someone has to fetch the books and files from the stacks. Someone, too, has to produce the books in the first place. I am indebted to my editor at Oxford University Press, Catherine Steele, both for her general enthusiasm for this project, and for her tolerance of its erratic process of generation. I apologize for alternating prolonged silences with occasional slab avalanches of text. As an avowed technophobe who can barely wire a plug, I am grateful to the extraordinarily generous Roger Davies for explaining the long history of explosives to me so patiently. Like so many other researchers, I feel privileged to be able to raid the unique treasure house of information that is the Global Terrorism Database. Long may it thrive. All work and no play have certainly taken their toll. During the course of writing this book, I once made the mistake of outlining the plot of Stanley Kubrick's classic 1980 horror film, The Shining, to my then 10-year-old son, Johnny. I explained in basic outline that the Jack Nicholson character, so to speak, loses it a bit after holing up in an out-of-season mountain hotel to write his masterpiece. Weekend disappearances to work on this manuscript were thereafter inevitably punctuated by regular telephone calls to ask, "Daddy, have you gone crazy yet?" No doubt my own kith and kin have their own answers ready to that particular query. Readers and reviewers, I dare to hope, may have others. A note on nomenclature and geographical parameters. Definitional dragons such as terrorism, violence, and modernity must all wait their turn for attempted slaying, however messily. Here I simply wish to note that I interpret the phenomenon of the coup rather narrowly, as an armed putsch, rather than in the broader sense of the state breaking its own constitution to override a parliament. This is a book primarily about North America and Europe. For convenience, I refer to this transatlantic zone by its traditionalist label, the West. Since these regions comprise the historic heartlands of what is now often called the Global North, I sometimes use that term as well, but do not include Japan by it. It is worth noting that my analytical treatment of Europe is also somewhat fluid. Between 1945 and 1990, for instance, the experience of Soviet-dominated Europe rather fades from view. Besides sporadic doom and uprising, political violence here overwhelmingly consisted of hijackings to facilitate escape to the West. So in practice, my area of focus remains firmly on North America and Western Europe, although in an interconnected world of decontextualized borrowings, it occasionally makes sense to glance further afield as well. Introduction. All these things belong to the Dark Ages. David Cameron, British Prime Minister on the Islamic State. Standing aghast is an unrewarding posture for anyone trying to pay close attention to the thread of history. Franklin L. Ford. At the heart of this book lies a simple ambition: to explore how forms of political violence have changed over time. Literatures on political violence spread ever larger. New mountain ranges of specialist studies are pushed up every year. The early 21st century has turned out to be a golden age for studying that very 19th century notion, the propaganda of the deed. And yet it remains a defensible general observation that most scholars involved in this burgeoning field remain far more interested in propaganda than in deeds. By contrast, this is a book emphatically about deeds, or more precisely, violent actions. Its starting premise is that the changing forms of political violence are well worth studying in detail and in their own right. Rather than treat them merely as incidental phenomena, it seeks to make acts, rather than ideas or ideologies, the central focus of study. It is most interested in how questions. How have acts of political violence changed over time? How have they evolved in conjunction with other forces? And if why questions are entertained, they are deliberately of a second-order variety. Why does this type of violence occur and not that? These may seem small questions, but they cast long shadows. Although a fuller exploration must necessarily wait until later, it is perhaps worth sketching 3 of the most imposing implications that stem from them here. First, no general assessment of contemporary political violence in the 21st century can avoid some engagement with questions of how far its quality and quantity is truly distinctive, in, at the very least implicit, comparison with previous ages. And here it seems hard to avoid attempting some analysis of changing patterns of action. General databases of terrorist incidents are indeed enormously helpful here, but very few stretch back more than 50 years, and, by their very nature, they bleach events of context. Arguably, the most interesting big questions, such as whether Western societies underwent a general brutalization process after the First World War, or whether a distinctively new terrorism arose in the late 20th century, can only be assessed meaningfully both with close regard to what actually happened, but also against longer-term contextual backdrops. Attractively Gnostic pronouncements, terrorism is as old as human civilization, and as new as this morning's headlines, do not really help us much here. Secondly, only a relatively fine-grained survey of changing patterns of action can hope to capture something of the relationship between contemporary political violence and modernity. This project is all the more necessary since too often contemporary violence is simply interpreted as representing some profound failure of modernization, a medievalism mercurially equipped with machine guns. This is a widespread popular assumption, but it is also one that commands some scholarly support as well. Wherever modernization touches societies, writes Michael Mazar, it leaves instability and disaffection in its wake. Hence, violence is essentially a symptom of incomplete or unsuccessful transition to modernity. More optimistically and heavily influenced by the work of Norbert Elias on changing manners, Steven Pinker sees modernity as a broad escalator of reason that sweeps away the futility of cycles of violence. What such approaches have in common is a basic indifference to understanding how violence actually works, and the sheer complexity of the relationships between violent acts and both changing technology and changing attitudes. Finally, and as a related point, a study of actual violent incidents against changing contexts might shed some light on what is one of the most puzzling features of so much contemporary political violence: its stunning impersonality. Acts of universal malice, to borrow the phrasing of the English common law, often seem particularly baffling. But it is precisely here that longer-term historical perspectives prove their value. Seen as a recurrent phenomenon, the bomb at the airport departure gate clearly does not belong to the same world of intimate killing that characterizes the pre-modern feud, the vendetta or the duel. A central assumption of this book is that different types of society will tend to facilitate different types of atrocity. Like broadly parallel but apolitical phenomena such as serial or spree killing, the airport bomb belongs to the Gesellschaft, a society of impersonal transactions, and not the Gemeinschaft, a society shaped primarily by face-to-face relationships. Its victims just happen, as the saying goes, to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. How killing became unchained from interpersonal relationships, then, forms a major running theme of this book. So a close-up focus on acts of political violence potentially opens up some surprisingly broad vistas of historical inquiry. Yet before they can be surveyed even impressionistically, some dense conceptual undergrowth in the foreground needs to be cleared. Two impressively prickly thickets stand out above all at first glance: political violence and terrorism. Here my intention is to find a path forward that makes sense, one that allows an attempt to chart, however impressionistically, shifting patterns of violent actions through time and changing contexts. It is not to establish conceptual categories of unimpeachable purity. This is a messy story. 1. How should we study such violence most profitably? Keep the subject area tight, suggests Randall Collins in his study of confrontation. Not violent individuals, but violent situations should hold the limelight. It is good advice. A focus on micro-actions involving, or at least threatening, the deliberate hurting of others seems highly advisable. Such tight focusing allows us to discard briskly classic notions such as Johann Galtung's structural violence to describe the fate of those who, to lift a phrase from Bob Dylan, are bent out of shape by society's pliers. Social structures are indeed often deeply oppressive, but this level of analysis risks taking us away from any consideration of grassroots actions. In general, the leading analysts of violence have tended to resist conceptual stretching and narrowed down the definition of violence to its physical dimension. Randall Collins is particularly forthright in his dismissal here of attempts to expand understandings of what constitutes violence further. Symbolic violence, he writes, is mere theoretical wordplay. To take it literally would be to grossly misunderstand the nature of real violence. And yet the notion of symbolic violence is not quite so easily dismissed, at least in modern societies that pride themselves upon the immaculate maintenance of public order. Here many threats are indeed clearly, mainly, or only symbolic, but may still constitute a significant disruptive intervention in public life. A bomb at the Eiffel Tower is always newsworthy, even if it was designed to hurt no one. Arguably, we need to leave analytical room for such theatrics in any long-term account of the development of political violence. A parallel point might be made about sabotage. Still, even within this broader field of view, it is at the level of specific actions and threats that we must arguably focus if we are to capture the changing quality of violence over time. Keeping a deliberately broad understanding of what might constitute political violence also seems sensible. As a shorthand concept, political violence implies some kind of intervention in the exercise of public power from the margins. That is, the state's own violence is rarely described as political. Broadly, I work within the parameters of this general understanding. Yet even here dilemmas remain. One of the old, but still rare, attempts to relate assassination to broader social, economic, or political factors reached the noticeably open-ended conclusion: only a fraction of political figures who are assassinated are killed for motives that are purely political. It is a useful reminder that the intentions of those who commit violence are often mixed or opaque, perhaps even to themselves. Conversely, there is plenty of evidence that the publicity that violence can bring itself represents a form of influence and hence power, however fleeting, to truly marginal people, or killer nerds. Here, Eliot Leighton has offered a powerful account of serial killers as representing a rare but logical extension of many of the central themes in their culture, of worldly ambition, of success and failure, and of manly avenging violence. Where, then, should one draw the line? Perhaps there are no entirely satisfactory answers here for a study focused on acts rather than intentions. I shall keep the main focus of analysis firmly on acts conventionally understood as political, that is, where violence was generally perceived as serving some wider public cause. Yet I shall endeavour to leave room to acknowledge the often close family resemblances and close cultural ties between distinctly modern types of violence that are too often segregated analytically into quite separate categories. After all, the spree killing and the marauding terrorist attack are essentially the same atrocity by different names. A focus on acts in historical context also avoids the arid definitionalism that has characterized so much analytical discussion of terrorism. Defining a concept like terrorism tightly, and then reverse engineering a genealogy to suit, seems an unpromising way to write a social history of political violence. Despite claims to the contrary, key concepts are anything but relatively timeless. They do not stand outside their time and place. But this is not to say that attempts at definition are entirely useless. It is simply to stress that their value for the historian may be suggestive rather than prescriptive. Arguably, the chief value of Alex Schmidt's monumental definitional labours is their unconsciously modernist assumption of a widespread abstraction of social relations. According to Schmidt, terrorism is an anxiety-inspiring method of repeated violent action employed by semi-clandestine individual, group, or state actors for idiosyncratic, criminal, or political reasons, whereby, in contrast to assassination, the direct targets of violence are not the main targets. The immediate human victims of violence are generally chosen randomly, targets of opportunity, or selectively, representative or symbolic targets, from a target population, and serve as message generators. Such a usefully provocative definition begs enough questions to keep conferences of historians busy for years. How did such a distinctively indirect type of violence emerge? And under what sort of historical conditions, and in what sort of societies, does a type of violence flourish in which the direct targets are not the main targets? These are questions that can all be usefully kept in mind throughout this book. I do not attempt to define exactly where the phenomenon of terrorism begins and ends. Such a shape-shifting term that has evolved from its common 18th and 19th century usage as implying the intimidation of the forces of reaction into a standard designation for a broad swathe of non-governmental violence, clearly needs to be handled with more analytical care than my broad historical narrative is able to offer. But I do broadly refer to terroristic acts in the Schmidian sense of actions that seem geared to a widespread broadcasting in which individual victims serve as mere message generators. In these cases, the main point remains that these particular victims are interchangeable. They carry semiotic or exchange value only. They are meat cashed in for mass publicity. In general, this shift towards depersonalized killing remains one of the least explained features of the broader transformation of Western societies into late modernity. This study attempts to make some sense of this evolving quality of public cruelty with reference to wider forces along the lines rather impressionistically sketched by Ziev Iviansky way back in 1977. Such individual terror was, Iviansky asserted, one of the manifestations of the modern age of violence, a symptom and expression of the great changes taking place in the spheres of social stratification, government, technology, ideology, and revolutionary activity. Yet this approach begs fresh questions in its turn about what parameters should be placed upon the search for origins. How far back should we look? And where? 2. On the morning of 11 November 1918, the German machine gunners near Mons fired off their ammunition up until the stroke of 11 o'clock. Then they rose, bowed, turned, and walked away from the war. Even in defeat, there could hardly have been a more impressive demonstration of the modern state's ability to turn on and off titanic quantities of destruction at will. Just a few weeks later, in a celebrated lecture, the great sociologist Max Weber was to elevate precisely this ability to the status of a definition. A state, he argued, was an entity that claims a monopoly of legitimate violence within a defined territory. And yet, as Weber knew only too well as the German Revolution bubbled away in the background, that monopoly was never total, and the illegitimate violence committed by those who do not wear uniforms is never banished totally, or at least not so for long. Even the most stable state will face such residual violence in the shape of acute political unrest from time to time. A full century on from the guns falling silent upon the Western Front, but opening up on the streets of Berlin, seems an appropriate moment to reflect upon Western traditions of violence. Deliberately, this study concentrates upon those strong states that were globally dominant from the late 18th to the opening of the 21st century. Those of Europe and America, the core of what is now often termed the global North. Dynamically capitalist and militarily overbearing, this mere handful of societies upended established orders across the globe. Yet at the same time, profound social transformations within the global North themselves proved conducive to the emergence of new constellations of violence. Of course, such changes were never simply self-generating nor hermetically sealed. It could hardly be otherwise during an age when European powers were so aggressively seeking to incorporate much of the globe into their own economic systems and formal empires. Despite asymmetries of power and influence, acontextual borrowings of violent tactics and technologies were almost inevitable under such conditions, and they flowed in all directions. Russia has long conventionally been seen as a sort of terrorism laboratory after 1878. The action templates of Narodnya Volya, the people's will, in particular, its early and enthusiastic adoption of dynamite, were soon revered and copied much further west. At the same time, Indian nationalists were also not slow to exploit new Western technologies of destruction against British dominance. And yet there still seems some merit in refocusing analytical attention back upon Western societies as incubators of Western political violence. Even during the high noon of late 19th century globalization, for instance, dynamite bombing remained overwhelmingly a Western phenomenon. When historians describe that whole network of changes that transformed Europe and the wider world from predominantly agrarian or small-town communities, governed by ancient religious and a customary tradition-bound culture, to a largely urban, industrial and secular society, writes Richard Overy, they use the term modernization. Of course, the shorthand term is a rough and ready one only, and globally such processes are far more open-ended and contingent than once thought. But if used carefully, the term modernity and modernization still retain some analytical utility, since they can capture a single condition or process that societies experience, albeit in their own peculiar ways. Among other key changes in these emerging societies of strangers was the increasing abstraction of many human relations. Indeed, the mobility and anonymity of modern society are very marked features of it. Violence is not immune from such profound changes. Indeed, it represents a key site of human interaction to observe such changes in action. As Albert Camus noted in 1946, just as we love one another by telephone, and work not on matters but machines, we kill and are killed nowadays by proxy. What is gained in cleanliness is lost in understanding. This book is written from the conviction that if studied carefully, the detail of such violence may indeed illuminate a wide social landscape and tell Western moderns something about themselves. But as Camus noted, this is not easy to do. It is not easy to do for at least two very good reasons. First, there is what might be termed the dazzling cleanliness of modernity's faith in its own distance from violence. Western civilization often appears to be built upon a social conquest of violence. Such views were already commonplace in the later 19th century. Ironically, the man who did more than any other individual to give modern political violence its distinctive cast, Alfred Nobel, the Lord of Dynamite, prophesied that progress would banish weapons. Especially in post-1968 European societies, all violence came to be seen as the antithesis of civilization. The second good reason why modern violence is hard to study in social context is the degree of dominance of the modern Western state both over and through society.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?